The OSS served as the investigational arm of the U.S. Prosecutor's Office for the Nuremberg Tribunal. But prior to that, they had done an analysis on what would happen and what Stalin's position was concerning the post-war trial process. And as you can see in this slide, the statement was to first liberate Europe from the Germans, next permit the liberated countries to select their own government. I wanted to put permit in a double quote. And thirdly, to take measures that all fascist criminals responsible for the war and the sufferings of the people bear stern punishment and retribution for all the crimes they have committed. Now, what's interesting about this is declared in November of 1943 by Stalin. However, the first calls to prosecute and judge the Germans were made by the Polish government. They could not clearly, at that time, attempt to bring the Soviet Union into the process, but they did request in January of 1940 that the Germans be brought to account. There was total silence on the part of Great Britain and France, and only 3 months later was a statement issued which talked about a public and formal protest, but it was really not much more than that. The British didn't want to offend the Germans because they might be upset at the thought that there would be a desire to destroy the German nation. And so there was going to only be a determination to right the wrongs inflicted on the Polish people. And they advised the Polish government in exile that this was simply a position statement. Now, the next major document that would lead us to the Nuremberg processes, and I use the term processes because I'm referring to both the tribunal and the trials, which were two separate things, was the white paper issued, the famous white paper issued by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs on December 10th, 1942, and let me emphasize that day and month once again, December 10th. It was addressed to the United Nations, although sometimes the term is capitalized and not, but it's the way the Allies were referring to themselves. And it was the first official assertion that an extermination of the Jews was underway. On December 17th, and this was, I apologize, I wrote, it's 10 days, but it's actually 7 days after the Polish white paper, the positions had changed of the British government. Clearly, there had to have been advance notice of the Polish white paper, or else people were scuttling around the British Foreign Office like lunatics for 7 days in order to prepare a position. But yet there was a declaration issued, and it was signed by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. So that, I think, helps supports my theory that this white paper must have been known earlier. And it also noted the extermination of the Jews and declared that the individuals responsible would be brought to court. The Soviets, of course, were not asleep at the helm. They formed the Extraordinary State Commission for Ascertaining and Investigating Crimes Perpetrated by the German fascist invaders and their accomplices by order of the Presidium on early November 1942. And there's a whole list of subcommittees and subcommissions that they created, and each report was submitted at the Nuremberg Tribunal. The best known of these reports was the Commission Report number 24, also noted as USSR Document 54, which dealt with the Katyn Massacre, the Burdenko Commission Report. Interestingly, there was a specific subcommission which dealt with the issue of religious structures and objects that had been destroyed by the Germans. This by a country that did its own destruction. So a year later, we have the Moscow Conference. This is the Moscow Conference after which one of the military attachés informs a colonel who's in contact with the U.S. Episcopacy of the impending visit of Father Orlemaisky to Moscow. But at that time, the Moscow Declaration was signed, and it was signed by the four ministers of state, of foreign affairs rather, of China, Great Britain, the US, and the USSR. There were four major points which dealt with the formation of what became the United Nations, and that concept of creating the United Nations had first been voted on a year early, way over it, more than a year earlier, on January 1st, 1942. And the fourth point, which was not signed by China, dealt with the issue of post-war courts. Germans who had participated in atrocities in the occupied territories would be arrested and returned to the nations where the crimes were committed to be judged. This is why some of the war trials take place in Poland, take place in Moscow, and take place in France. From the U.S. point of view, what was the status of the war in 1943? Actually, the Western Allies' viewpoint. There were victories in El Alamein, Stalingrad, Rommel had withdrawn from North Africa, and the battle for the Solomon Islands in the Pacific had ended, but Leningrad was certainly still under siege, and Japan controlled all of Southeast Asia. The Germans were in control of the Eastern Mediterranean. Nonetheless, the plan to bring the Germans to trial was moving ahead. We move fast forward to 1945, to August, after the end of the war in Europe, certainly, and just about at the end of the war in the Pacific. And in London, they signed an agreement to set the stage for the trial process, which there were four sets of charges: planning crimes against peace, participating in crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. There was a series of meetings that took place in London, at which only the prosecutors who were named in that declaration were present, i.e. the nations of France, Great Britain, the USA, and the USSR. And it was at the final London meeting that the USSR prosecutor presented the charge concerning the Katyn massacre and noted, pay attention, that 925 officers had been murdered. The US and British prosecutors protested, but then ultimately stated, it's your ball game. You get to prosecute what happened in Eastern Europe or in the territories that you occupied. If you can do it, go ahead. So the tribunal is the best known of the trials in Nuremberg. And it is the best, it was the major process, and it started in November of 1945 and ended on January 10th, 1946. And it dealt only with the major criminals and organizations. There were 24 people who were charged. The judges, as well as the prosecutors, emerged from the four countries. The trials, however, were conducted by individual countries. The best known of them are the 12 trials that were conducted by the United States and took place in Nuremberg. So, how did the tribunal work? There were two judges from each nation, the primary and his deputy. It's interesting to note who the judges were, since the primary Soviet judge was the main judge during the Great Terror, and the prosecutor on the part of the Soviets, Rudnenko, was prosecutor in the case of the 16. Does everybody know what the case of the 16 was?
Assume no.
Thus, okay, so I'll have to back up when my slide moves forward. The 16 were the AK, or Home Army members, who were told to come to a meeting. They would not be charged, there would be no harm to them, yada, yada, yada. They are brought to Moscow, where they are A, put on trial, or B, liquidated, die under mysterious circumstances. Litvinenko has nothing on them. And of course, General Rudenko received the Commander's Cross of the Order Odrodzenia Polski. And he conducted the trial for the crimes in Eastern Europe. Prosecuted that. So among the 24 individuals who were charged were Martin Bormann, Hans Frank, who was the governor of the general government, Hermann Goering, and Joachim von Ribbentrop. The charges were formulated in accordance with the London Charter as well as the earlier Moscow Charter. The Katyn Massacre Charter, in accordance with the official distribution of responsibilities, were presented by the USSR prosecutor. And Wild Bill Donovan advised Justice Jackson in personal memos about the fact that the charge could lead to a failure for the entire prosecutional case. Fast forward to 1952. Judge Jackson is testifying in front of the Madden Committee. He comes in with a prepared statement, which he reads, which also directs the way the questioning will then take place. And at this point he's saying, well, the charges could only be presented if guilt could be proved. We're not charging anybody unless we're sure we can prove their guilt. We don't want verbal testimony, emotional testimony, personal testimony. We want papers and documents located in German archives. Well, clearly in the case of the Katyn massacre, you weren't going to find documents that would prove German guilt in the German archives. All you could find was Massenmord, which was the German white paper issued on the issue of the Katyn massacre. So what did Justice Jackson actually receive in 1945 prior to the tribunal? He received a copy of Massenmorde, which you can find in his files at the Library of Congress. He received a one-page memo from General Clay, who was governor of the American sector, confirming that that no one in Poland would assign guilt to the Germans for the crime. A document from, and that is also in the Library of Congress, a document signed by a number of members of the Polish government in exile asking that the issue of Katyn not be brought up at the tribunal because they certainly knew how it was going to be handled. A material sent by military intelligence, a short memo from General Donovan, an analysis of the charges prepared by Schlabendorf, and we'll talk about each of these people. Donovan actually treated Jackson, when he was appointed, almost as his protege. He took him around Washington and introduced him because he knew everybody in Washington to ensure that there would be money assigned to the tribunal that, for the prosecutors and for the judges so that they could proceed. Later, an enormous disagreement occurred between them, I'll call it that, and Donovan resigned from his position. There was a memo issued, just so that you would know, that this was confirming Jackson's position, that they were seeking written materials concerning German crimes. There were a number of people who worked with the OSS in Nuremberg. Wiet Valentin, Fabian von Schlabendorf. He also was a German as well as Valentin, and he was a lawyer. He went to Britain and, I'm sorry, not Schlabendorf, I apologize. He participated in the various assassination attempts on Hitler. If you remember the attempt that took place with the bottles of cognac or champagne that weren't bottles of liquor. Champagne, I thought it was champagne, I forgot for a moment. That weren't and were supposed to explode on the plane.
Yes.
Well, when he found out that Hitler's plane had gotten back and had landed and hadn't exploded, he was crazy enough to get on the next plane and fly in to pick up the bottles and bring them back, just to make sure that nobody found out that there had been a plot that hadn't succeeded.
The mercury froze. They didn't think about that.
This minor detail. And he was the one, as a lawyer, who wrote the memo on the charges for Donovan and stated that the Germans could not be charged with the Katyn massacre, that the entire trial process would fall apart. Dr. Alexander Pathy, a mysterious Hungarian who ends up working in Persia for the Shah, was also an employee of the OSS, and although he wrote a book, I still can't find his photo, and he was the next person to comment, in this case, on Schlabendorf's report on the charges. Clemens von Klemperer was a historian who was stripped of his citizenship, fled to Britain, and then with the start of the war, the British fired anybody who was of German citizenship who was teaching at, or former German citizenship who was teaching at a university. And so he was one of 12 students accepted at Harvard, and then worked for military intelligence at SHAEF headquarters. Everybody know what SHAEF is?
Is that supposed to be 62, not 26?
46.
42 to 46.
42. Oh, yes, sorry for the typo, thank you. Another person that was involved with the Nuremberg Tribunal was, of course, Rafał Lemkin, born in Lvov, and he is the creator of the concept and the term genocide. And he conducted literally classes in the evenings for the US prosecutorial team to understand the concept of crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on. Now, what happened? There's been a lot of controversy as to whether General Anders wanted to, refused to, was or was not invited to participate in the tribunal. Did he lose a great chance? Well, Goering's defense counsel asked him to testify about Katyn. The general clearly refused, and he wrote a letter to the prosecutor, not to the defense counsel, stating that he could not aid in the defense of Germans. In that letter, he also advised Judge Jackson that if he was called by the prosecutor, he would testify on this matter. Jackson later claimed that he hadn't received that correspondence. And in 1946, curiously enough, a privately printed English language report over 300 pages, including documentation on the Katyn massacre, and entitled Facts and Documents, was issued, and I believe it was prepared for the Nuremberg Tribunal. An updated version was submitted to the Madden Committee in 1952 and became part of their records. How did the Soviets respond to this during the tribunal? Their main charges appeared in paragraph C of the accusatory statement and listed a number of massacres, one of them being the Stalag 3 massacre, the one where they escaped, and then when they got caught, the Germans killed 50 POWs, executed them, and Katyn was the last massacre on that list. As time passed, we get to February 14th, 1946. The Soviet prosecutor, in his verbal statement, accuses the Germans of perpetrating the Katyn massacre. It is July 1946 when the witnesses, 6 witnesses, were questioned on Katyn. Soviet prosecutors were of the opinion that the Burdenko Commission report was evidentiary documentation and German guilt was proven. And they're completely befuddled why Western prosecutors can't accept this and support them in this position. then this is interesting. For those of you who know, the Soviets claimed that they did not inherit the treaties and declarations, a number of them, that had been signed by the Tsarist government. And so they did not accept the Hague and Geneva Conventions. Yet, they invoked the Geneva Convention on February 14th, referring to prisoners of war held in 3 camps who were taken prisoner in the fall of 1941 prior to the start of the war and who were laboring on railroad construction. The prosecutor then stated that there were 11,000 victims buried in Katyn, which clearly the Soviets knew that that was not the number of victims buried there, and was a change from their original allegation that there were 925 victims buried there. And this is important. He specifically charged Colonel Arnes of the 357th Engineering Battalion, which was a major error. On May 11th, the Soviet prosecutor is outraged that Goering's defense counsel wants to call up witnesses concerning Katyn and protests and says they cannot be called. And he says if the Germans want to present 2 witnesses, the USSR will present 10 witnesses, and new documents, and they'll read the entire Burdenko report into the files, into the record. And by June, once again, Rudenko claims that the Burdenko document is an unassailable proof of guilt. He also states that Colonel Einhorn, who had served in the same company, could not testify since he is guilty and his guilt is apparent. And he also does not agree to testimony by other individuals. The actual testimony on the Katyn matter took place over the course of 4 days. At that point, the USSR had decided that they were going to call all 120 witnesses who had appeared in front of the Burdenko Commission. The tribunal ruled that 3 witnesses could appear on each side, and the defense called upon Colonel Arends, Einhorn, and Oberhauser from the 537th. The USSR prosecutors presented the mayor of Smolensk, Vasilevsky, Dr. Markov, who was a member of the International Medical Commission, and Viktor Prosorovsky of the Burdenko Medical Commission. And at that point, Markov completely renounced what he had signed and stated 3 years earlier. Defense counsel also presented the Massenmorde and London reports, which it stated it had received from Polish sources, and were once again attacked by Prosecutor Rudenko. As a result of the witness testimony, the issue of Katyn disappeared from the list of charges. And after 5th July 1946, it disappeared, and no decision was ever made by the Nuremberg Tribunal. And I've got 3 minutes. The CIC investigation in the spring of 1948. There's a file of some 200 pages containing reports, interviews, testimony taken by the Counterintelligence Corps in Austria, which also crossed over in the green border into Slovakia to interview Dr. Subik. It conducted an interview with Lieutenant Slovenchuk, who died before the Madden Committee started functioning. And this was a mystery as to why they were conducting this investigation. In fact, yesterday, in reviewing the Madden Committee materials once again, I located a memo, 2 lines in a memo, that state the CIC investigation of 1948, who ordered it and why? Well, I think I know why. After the tribunal ended, there were 12 trials, as I mentioned, which were conducted by U.S. prosecutors. The last of these trials was the Wehrmacht trial, and General Telford Taylor was the prosecutor. That trial started on December 31st, 1947 and ended in the fall of 1948. And I believe that the issue or the reason that the orders were given to investigate Katyn in May of 1945 were that they wanted to be sure that the issue of Katyn had been investigated and was no longer a major item to be dealt with at a later point in time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your invitation.
Great.
I think I was on time. All right, who calls on people? I call?
Maria.
The gentleman in the cap and glasses was first, so
We don't have a microphone, I just speak loudly. I have to admit, I'm still, I hope you can help me out on this. When I was very young, over in the Silver Spring Library, I pulled out some book and totally ascribed the Katyn massacre to the Germans. Okay, so that's what I grew up with, right? And then, of course, all these things have happened since
take that and flip it over.
However, I'm trying to make this short. So recently, not recently, but if you go to YouTube and just download one of the weekly issues of the Goebbels Deutsche Wochenschau, they have one that is devoted to the German army's discoveries at Katyn. It's rather, it's a long segment, many minutes. Now, I don't know how many people would have read the white paper, maybe that's for scholars, but a lot of people watch that Deutsche Wochenschau, and it's still
Allow me to interject. The reason the Germans announced Katyn in April of '43 was that they were still hoping, especially on the part of the Wehrmacht and Canaris, to cause a split, a rift, between Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Canaris met with Donovan in Spain and at another location, and the proposition was that they would call a ceasefire with Britain and the United States. They wanted to continue a war with the Soviets, and in fact they even offered to remove Hitler. But aside from that, when they made the announcement, they first brought in two groups of journalists in separate days. I'm not talking about Polish journalists, I'm talking about Western European, and then, like, when I say Western European, I'll be saying more like Sweden and France and so on. And then on another date, they brought in the occupied countries journalists. They had their publication called Signal, which was published in 26 languages and published stories about this. The Portuguese published it in Belém. I mean, it was flooded. In fact, one of the statements when the CIC investigation starts was, I don't want people who know about Katyn. Everybody knows about it. I want people who were there, who saw something. So everybody knew, and the United States received coded letters from two of its POWs who had been forced to travel to Katyn, and who wrote and advised the United States government in '43 and in early '44 that definitively the Soviets were responsible. Sir.
It's always good when a scholar discovers new source material, but from having read Janusz Zawodny's 1962 book, Death in the Forest, I'm wondering what this new material changes about his conclusions.
I'm not changing Zawodny's conclusions. I'm simply presenting documentation that information was given to the United States government. I attempted to present, in the slide where I discussed the status of the war, the difficult position, in quotes, that the United States felt it was in. It felt it was conducting the war in the Pacific on its own. The Soviets still had a non-aggression, and in fact an alliance pact in force with the Japanese, and the Americans were literally afraid that the Soviets would start supporting the Japanese. So we have a problem, and how do we deal with it? And FDR, in terms of publicity, doesn't want any more dead bodies coming back of American boys than he has to have coming back. So what happened was we had the coded letters. We had the reports written in November of '44 by a British military doctor who was part of the group that was forced to go to Katyn. In January of '45, we had a South African officer write a report. We had a civilian who was an internee who was forced to go, who did a report and reported to MI9 when he was released. We had John Van Vliet's May 10th, 1945, Paris sworn deposition to the War Crimes Tribunal that disappeared into the ether. And if you want to think about that, that will help you understand why John Van Vliet's report of May 23rd, 1945 had to disappear. Because his war crimes sworn deposition was attached to that report. And I give my head that it was attached to that, because he does that in Paris on May 10th, he's in Washington on the 17th, and he meets with Bissell on the 22nd. And the report is filed on the 23rd. Bissell knew. Van Vliet didn't know how the war crimes trials would be prosecuted. And Bissell knew that this issue could not be brought up.
He was the head of G2,
Correct.
correct? Yeah.
Correct. Sir?
You sort of skipped over the fact that you look at the Venona tapes, the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, including Donovan's staff, had all sorts of Soviet agents in it, and so
The Venona tapes also include Colonel Zarubin, also known as Zablubin.
The head
Zablubin.
of Soviet espionage,
He was,
who earlier was in charge of
he was
counterintelligence.
the interrogator in Kosciuszko.
Yeah, Kosciuszko.
Multilingual, very cultured, discussed literature with the men he was questioning. And Zarubin, when the announcement is made about Katyn, sends a Venona file, he sends a cable to Moscow, a coded cable, in which she's freaking out. And anybody who's military here will know, anybody who's ever worked in the services would agree, even though they won't shake their heads. You never mention the subject crime, even in a coded message. And he sends the coded message saying, they're following me, they know I was in Kosciuszko, they know about Katyn. And the result is that he gets hauled back home, rather than just sending a cable saying, you know that fever I had, it seems to be coming back, I think I need to come back for treatment. But they weren't following him, by the by, because of Katyn. Do we have time for another question, or is there another question?
One last question, if there is one.
I guess there, oh, yes.
So I'll just lay my ignorance out here for everyone to see. Why would the Russians?
Well, at least you're honest.
Why would the Russians be so eager to cover up Katyn Forest Massacre when they had been responsible for so many other things?
Because this was the first time, they're attempting, come on, don't look at him like
They
that.
have to 28,000 Allied officers, not just a million kulaks, 28,000 Allied officers.
And they're trying to
That was the
enter
problem.
into the
Not
civilized
communist
world of nations. Remember, they don't have relations with the United States until '33. They now have an opportunity to prove that they joined the big boys club, but you have certain manners of behavior. To admit to the murder of 28,000 people, to admit that you executed POWs while you're alleging that the Germans maltreated your men, because they were POWs, kind of conflicts.
But were the massacres of the Bolshevik Revolution and everything that had come before that, was that not common knowledge at the time?
That was irrelevant. That took place
Internally.
internally. It didn't take place and deal with the outside world. The outside world did not, at that point in time, look at internal crimes like they do now. Nobody was bringing up a dictator from Africa up on charges of crimes against humanity because Lemkin hadn't talked yet. But certainly they were talking about Geneva and Hague conventions and how POWs were to be treated. And so if you want to be part of the boys club and sit down to tea at the big desk in the White House Oval Office.
I just want to tell you, remember, Poland was still up for grabs. So it was very important to the West not to have that crime to reckon with as they were handing Poland over. That's why the stakes were high.
Thank you very much.
All right.